Okay, well, thank you so much. Now we're going to turn to our discussion about bias and AI. And Whitney Levendowski at our office is going to moderate this. So Whitney, take it away.
All right, thank you, Katie. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you to the music panel for starting the conversation about bias in artificial intelligence and ethics in artificial intelligence. This is a topic that touches on all matters involving AI. It is an issue if you are a consumer of AI, if you are a creator of AI, if you are a creator who has found their works incorporated into artificial intelligence. So I'm really excited that we get to spend some time on this topic. And one of the things that's kind of repeated itself throughout the day is the tension between computer and human. So in copyright, we think about it as the computer-generated versus the human-generated. And when it comes to bias in AI, when we find ourselves surprised that the outputs of an AI system don't reflect the best of us and sometimes reflects the worst of us, we often talk about it in terms of objects. We talk about bad data. We talk about the algorithm. But within all of these situations are humans. Humans making decisions. They're selecting, coordinating, arranging the data that goes into the system. They're building the algorithm. They're making decisions based off of the raw output that the AI is making. And so for today, what I would like to discuss, we're going to be talking about those objects that are involved and that implicate, that kind of come into play when we talk about bias, but we're also looking to center humans. If you are creating an AI system, what might you be thinking of? If you are a consumer, like what are your questions? And Dr. Ulrike Till in the international session said that the important thing with intellectual property and artificial intelligence is to ask the questions. That we may not have answers all the time, but it's important to keep asking the questions. So that's my job as moderator. And as moderator, I get to ask questions of two great experts. And I'd like to spend just a moment introducing both of them. So to my left, I have Amanda Levendowski. She is the Associate Professor of Law, and she's the founder of the Intellectual Property and Information Policy Clinic at Georgetown Law. And then I also have Miriam Vogel, who's the Executive Director of EqualAI, which is an organization that is committed to addressing the question of bias in artificial intelligence. So without further ado, I would like to turn to Miriam and ask her to set the scene for us. What is bias in artificial intelligence?
Well, thank you for that great question. Bias in artificial intelligence is inevitable from my perspective. I should take a step back and tell you what EqualAI is, because most of you are probably not familiar with our new organization. We were created a year and a half ago by Arianna Huffington, Rob Locascio of LivePerson, Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia, and others who started seeing how AI is being used in ways big and small throughout our day and lives, and that it's actually influenced by bias. It turns out that is, I would say, inevitable, because if you look at what machine learning is in particular, but AI in general, it's pattern recognition. It's getting to the answer quicker. It's solving for the answer by recognizing patterns. In the same way, if you look at what is implicit bias, it's recognizing patterns and making decisions accordingly. So there's no way you're going to, from my perspective, remove bias from AI because it is necessarily biased. What we can, should, and need to do is look at the ways that it is unconsciously biased. We need to set the guardrails of what are the biases that we will not accept and how will we solve for them.
Thank you. And so we talk about unconscious bias, and maybe one of the things that we can think about is transparency, right? So if bias is inevitable and we are looking towards moving our unconscious bias to conscious bias, how do we inform people about that, like the bias that is reflected in an AI system?
I'm happy to take it, but I also very much want to hear what the professor has to say. So I think that's actually the most important piece of what we can do here together. All of us have a responsibility. Once we recognize this problem, we all have this responsibility, I would argue, as a consumer, as a person, as a parent, as a classmate, whatever your role is, you have a responsibility to do something about it once you know that it exists. We have to hold companies accountable, and we have to get our lawmakers to act on this, because there's going to be this inevitability of companies answering to shareholders. They have their bottom lines. They are set up for profits. They are not going to necessarily be looking for all the different potential harms or downstream users of their products. That's incumbent upon us to demand of them and to make that a part of the expectation for the products that they are creating.
And so are there best practices that companies and researchers can implement so that maybe there is less anger at the shareholder meeting?
Absolutely. And for anyone who wants more detail, we actually do a half-day workshop. So I'll give you a brief snapshot today of what I share and what we talk about through that experience. But basically, it's a two-part situation. First of all, it's recognizing all the different touch points where bias can seep into AI. And that's essentially looking at all the human touch points. It's looking at the design, it's looking at the data that's being used to feed the AI program. It's looking at who's testing this AI to make sure that it's not harming and hopefully is helping more people. And so we have a variety of solutions that we ask companies to take on when creating AI, but we also have a 5-pillar framework that we recommend that all companies follow if they're serious about combating an AI. And we actually take a step back before the AI creation and even before the hiring of employees who will be impacting this AI. And we say that if you're going to be serious about combating bias in AI, you have to invest in the pipeline. You have to make sure that we have more people of color, more women, more voices from more regions. It's not, you can't just solve for this by looking at 1 or 2 categories. You need to be thinking about the universe of who will be impacted by the product and making sure that they are participating in the AI creation. The second pillar is looking at your HR systems, and we're calling it hiring, promoting with your values. So we know that there's implicit bias in hiring patterns and also in promoting. For instance, if you look at women in the tech space, there's estimates that they are between 20 and 30% of the workforce. If you look at the executive level, it's half that. And if you're talking about people of color, it's also half that. So we need to make sure that in addition to the implicit bias of the humans who are in the hiring and promotion, that we're not doubling down on discrimination through the AI products that are being used more and more with companies large and small across the world in hiring and promotion. Third, we say that you have to evaluate the data set. You have to see, based on the data that you're using, where are the gaps? If you're talking about a AI for healthcare product, you're going to have limited data sets. If it's insurance data, you're not going to have people of certain economic brackets who can't afford insurance. If it's genomic data, it's on average 80% or more of people from European descent. So where are you going to find gaps that you need to change? There are ways to change it. It's getting different data, or it's solving for overrepresenting, underrepresenting based on the population you want to be serving and what's not available to you in that data that you're using. But you're not going to be able to see everything in the data because you're talking about terabytes. So then you have to dissect your data. That's the next pillar. There are tools available, but there's also testing. It's just interrogating the data, solving for, if it's a hiring program, who are great candidates that are being left out if you test the system. And you can use data, and I know Professor Levendowski will talk more about accessing different data sets, but it's imperative that you test out the AI products that are already in existence, and this is true for both those who are developing the AI, but also the majority of us who are the users. We are equally responsible for ensuring that the AI that we're using and consuming doesn't discriminate or produce outcomes that are different than what we want. And then finally, we say the final column is reevaluating who your team is. Because a lot of people will tell you, there's nothing we can do about the current biases if it's a reflection of us. Our coding pool is mostly white males. That's who's available to be coding these days. And our leadership team is what it is. But there's a really simple solution for that. And one of the companies that seed funds me, LivePerson, has this really interesting workaround where they create chatbots. So rather than just relying on the chatbot creator, coder, programmers, they actually went to the call centers and had their input in the chatbots they were creating. And it turns out, not only was it skyrocketing in terms of the consumer satisfaction and the employee satisfaction, the products sold off the shelf because they had the input of the various perspectives, not just those who had been creating the AI initially. So that's a much longer answer than you're probably looking for, but I'll stop myself because I could go on.
Yeah, no, so it seems like we've got some good tenets to think about from a corporate standpoint. So your human touch points, I really like that, where you're taking a look, and every time that the human hands are involved in the AI system, and that's from hiring, that's building your team, looking at the skill set, making sure that there is sort of some effort put in terms on representation and making sure that there's a variety of perspectives, and then taking a look at your data. And it seems like it's both focusing on maybe the specific issues with your data, but then also the general trends that come with certain sectors of data. And so I wonder if, Professor, you can drill down on that data issue.
It would be my delight. Question, how many of the people in the room actually know how AI works? Like they could explain it to a friend over dinner. Oh, a pretty good number. Okay, so this is perfect. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use an easy example featuring one of my favorite topics of conversation, my cat, and I'm going to explain to you how bias works its way into these AI systems, and I'm going to make it as simple as humanly possible, though I'm sure a computer could do better. So, if I'm looking to build an AI system that recognizes cats, because I want to walk into the world, and whenever there's a cat nearby, I want to know about it. I think you all relate. When you're walking around and you're thinking about that, I would first have to start with training data. I would need to train the artificial intelligence algorithm. The most common application currently that's commercially viable is called machine learning, something you've probably read about in the news. So if I'm creating a machine learning algorithm to recognize cats, I have to start with training data. And unfortunately, I've looked up how much it costs to license one image of a particular type of cat, and it's $175. And you need thousands and thousands of images to effectively train an AI system to be accurate, so I'm probably not going to want to license that. Instead, I'm going to turn my attention to an easily available, legally low-risk source of data. I want to know that I own the intellectual property rights so that I'm not dealing in licenses or even thinking about fair use, though I would love to think about it later. And I want to make sure that it's easily available, not something that's going to take a lot of computing power for me to actually integrate into the algorithm. And I have exactly the perfect source right in my pocket. It's my camera's photo roll. I have an incredible number of pictures of my cat just sitting and ready to become data for this machine learning algorithm. So I take the data that I've selected, I feed it to the machine learning algorithm, and I realize that I have two different but equally important problems. Miriam touched on the different potential human touch points at the stage in the process, and we've now touched on two. One of them is the selection of the data, and the second one is the creation of the algorithm. And depending on how I create this algorithm, I'm going to get biased results based on the data I've input. If I train the algorithm to focus on the colors of what a cat is, it's only going to pick up on the colors of my specific cat because that's 100% of the training data. So the machine learning algorithm is going to think that a melange of gray and orange and cream and black is what makes a cat. But if you looked around any urban environment, that actually describes an enormous number of buildings, patches of dirt, brindle dogs, none of which are cats. So I've essentially created a biased algorithm that specializes in false positives. Now we can go the other direction and I say, okay, pretend that the colors don't matter and we're not looking for tortoiseshell cats only. We want to look for something different. It's going to look at a potential picture of a cat and say, I want the features of a cat. I want big pointy ears. I want big fluffy fur. I want a long tail. Well, now we're going to get some false negatives because if you know anything about cat taxonomy and based on some of your faces, you're like, of course I don't. That's a very weird thing to know about. If you do know anything about cat taxonomy, you have Scottish folds, which have folded down ears. You have Manx cats, which have bobbed tails. And you have cats like mine, a Devon Rex, that have short fur. So you're going to get some false negatives, things that are cats that the algorithm is not going to recognize as such. Now, this might seem very dumb and whimsical when we're talking about recognizing cats, but if you're talking about facial recognition algorithms that are used to make decisions about whether people are engaged with our criminal justice system, false negatives and false positives are not just engineering goofs. They are life-changing due process problems that we are still grappling with. So that's the basics of how this final piece of how the human touch point gets integrated. It's this outputs in the data set. So now we've got this full stack of how bias can get introduced at every step of the process. And if we zoom out, there's even a bigger meta question about the human touch point and bias, which is, should we be building this system in the first place?
Mm-hmm. And so that there are some systems now, and you talk about facial recognition, that there are some companies who are want to bring facial recognition to the consumer sphere. And so it's now governments and the private individual who have these tools at their use. How should an individual think about these things, and what makes a conscious consumer? So this is both an ethical issue in terms of engaging with a product that will have a bias of some sort, and then also an accountability issue. Miriam, you talked about how we as individuals can hold business to account. So what is as an individual, how do we navigate this bias issue?
I think facial recognition is such a good example because it's something that people can experience in a way that commercially makes their lives easier. If you're one of those folks who uses facial recognition to log into your phone, you might find that to be a really easy, frictionless way to not have to remember yet another password. But we can also think about it being used in this dual use, right, by governments. And I think this is one of those places where saying decreasing the bias in the algorithm is maybe not always going to be the satisfying right answer. Mm-hmm. Because if you think about the way these systems are going to be deployed by government, perhaps, they're going to be used for surveillance. We statistically know that surveillance is largely going to be targeted at communities of color the way that it often is, and that's where a lot of the policing is going to occur. And the problem with that is that having perfectly accurate facial recognition doesn't solve the underlying bias of how that technology is used. And that's why I think it's so important for consumers who are engaged in this question to think critically about whether these systems are something we even want to be introduced into our society. So, for example, facial recognition has been shown by research done by Georgetown's Privacy Center called Perpetual Lineup, if you're curious and looking at the information, statistically shown to be biased amongst certain groups against people of color, young people, and women. And so while you might be able to, say, introduce new data to compensate for those biases, even having perfect facial recognition doesn't solve the underlying problem about whether it's going to be used for over-surveillance against particular communities. And you can think about this in other types of applications of machine learning as well. Mm-hmm. We still need to ask that interrogation ethical question as consumers of, do we want this? And the answer across multiple jurisdictions so far has been a resounding no. Washington currently has a bill introduced. There's other bills that have been introduced in suburbs of Boston to ban face recognition used by law enforcement, in part because of these concerns that it's almost a sort of unsafe at any speed argument, right? Bias is certainly a huge part of the problem, but it doesn't provide us all of the answers, as you were saying earlier.
Mm-hmm. And Miriam, from a consumer perspective, from an individual perspective, how should you think about or encounter these issues?
I like the approach that some have taken when a consultant to engineer happened to be affiliated with the company, tested the product and saw that he wasn't able to identify his face properly. He sounded loud on social media. I think making sure that you're testing out, you should have access to any public product. And if it's not recognizing you or serving you properly, then we can't wait till the unmanned vehicle can't detect a female figure and has an accident before we correct for it. So I think making sure that people are raising their hand and saying, I want to make sure this is safe for me. I want proof that this is accessible to me. Again, there's a variety of harms. There's Nikon tried to make an AI program to enable people to be better photographers. And they apparently had no one Asian on their team because if you had Asian eyes, it would label them as closed. So, people should be demanding that this AI works for them. And whether it's a fatal harm or a harm along that lines, it's the company's responsibility. And at the end of the day, the argument I make to companies and that I think consumers would certainly support and should is that it's their product reputation on the line. It is their trust and integrity. And Google was able to overcome that lapse in their AI identification. But could a smaller company that we're less reliant on, and then you have to think about, I also talk to companies about the employee morale. Think about how at a company like that, when they've missed and when they've harmed a consumer, whether it's by not being inclusive in their product or an actual physical harm, think about how that impacts employee morale, where they're trying to create these AI products that are going to save the world, make it more efficient, make it more fun, make it safer. There's a real impact. Right now, we know there's a war to get the best employees possible. So if you're in the AI space, you can't afford to be harming employee morale in that way. And then there's legal liability, which I found with most of the companies I talk to, that's often the point where I get their attention. So I think that we've seen a bit of case law so far, trying to decipher where the liability resides, who's responsible in these oversights in the AI space. I think we can expect to see a lot more.
So you talk about liability as sort of something that kind of can hook people, can hook businesses, and so it seems like that there's often a business decision and a legal analysis that happens. I wonder, Professor, if you could just speak very briefly about how individuals make choices to engage with or avoid trademark and IP issues in the selection of their data.
Sure. Well, because so much of the data that we were talking about earlier is protected by copyright law, there's a real question about how to pick data that's going to be legally low risk and easily accessible to use for machine learning. And unfortunately, because of those hurdles related to potentially licensing all of that images, it's not necessarily that people are just using them anyway, although that's often the case. But one of the other things that happens is people turn to biased, low-friction data, easily available, but definitely biased. Examples can include using exclusively public domain data to train your natural language processing algorithm, which may seem like an incredible rich source of text, but is only going to be as basically be as woke as the year 1925, which I think we all agree was not that woke. And that's a potential problem for the training data. Another possibility would be turning to Creative Commons licensed data, which has an incredible number of benefits as well. It's a more contemporary corpus of work. However, if you're looking at who contributes to the largest resource of Creative Commons licensed data that's freely available to use, that's Wikipedia. And that's largely dominated by white male editors from Western countries. So the information is biased. The information I love, or the example I love to use about Creative Commons licensed data is Rob Gronkowski, tight end for the New England Patriots, not playing this year. But the article about Rob Gronkowski is about 3,000 words long. The article about the first woman admitted to the New York State bar doesn't exist. So it's not even about what the articles say that you're feeding back into the algorithm. It's whether or not the articles are even available to train these systems. Mm-hmm. So in both of those cases, you can see how being concerned about intellectual property liability might channel creators of AI to choose biased data because it seems easy. And in the paper that I wrote about this issue, the largest example is the Enron emails dataset, which if you don't know, most of the machine learning that you've interacted with in the last 5 years has been trained on 1.6 million real emails sent between the executives of a Houston oil and gas company that collapsed under investigation for fraud at a federal level. And you can think about whether there might be some biases embedded in the Enron emails. And I think that there's actually some research that shows that the answer is yes. It's not representative socioeconomically, geographically, not in terms of race and gender, certainly. And all of those biases are then fed into a system that can potentially amplify them. So all of those are in response to trying to avoid liability for intellectual property infringement, mm-hmm. and instead we get biased, junky data that's informing the AI systems we interact with every day.
So AI, we call it machine learning, we call it machine process, but there's actually all of this bias implications is because of the human involvement, whether it's in the creation of the data, the selection of the data, the production of the AI, or the deployment of the AI. Miriam?
Even in the design.
In the design of the AI.
Yeah, if you're making a hiring, sorry.
No, go. Go for it.
Even if you're talking about a hiring algorithm, most companies I work with now are using AI somewhere in their hiring process, whether it's deciphering through resumes, video analysis, et cetera. the person who's designing that AI has a bias in mind of who the ideal candidate is. So aside from the fact that the data from their company or the data in the AI program they're using is very likely to be biased, you even have it starting out asking the question, because an algorithm is often described as an opinion. Who are you solving for? Who are you looking for? And I think we can only expect people to be creative as their mindset allows. And that's why this age-old issue begs for an age-old answer. I wish I had something, a sexy AI answer I could give, but you have to have diversity of
There's no
perspective.
sexy AI.
Well, I will leave that you won't be limited by our bias. You can have your own bias as to whether or not that's the case.
True, that is my bias.
There it is, and we can all share our biases as part of this. We can raise our hands and share, but at the end of the day, a diversity of thought and perspectives, I think, is the best tool, and that's why the consumer awareness is the best tool to make sure that we reduce this problem. But I'm sorry, you were
No,
asking
thank you. Hey, that's great. I just want to spend just one moment to see if there are any questions in the audience. Anyone that might? Yes, I've got a question in the back. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's you.
Hi, I'm Becca Tan, and I'm a librarian here in the Copyright Office. I have a couple of questions about EqualAI. So you talked about the 5 pillars of your recommendations for companies. So how are those enforced? What are some of the follow-up processes that you might have for companies that have committed to those recommendations? And just in terms of incentive for signing on to those recommendations, you mentioned legal liability, but I think we've seen, and it's been discussed in the panels today, that a lot of the legal regulations haven't caught up to the technology that's being made, and unfortunately large tech companies are often the exception when it comes to those legal rulings. So would love to hear a little bit more about how that is being enforced and followed up on.
Well, thank you, Becca, for that great question, and I'd like to enlist your help for EqualAI going forward so we can put some of that to good use. So enforcement of our pillars. I wish I could tell you that I am an enforcement agency or aligned with one that could enforce this in some way. I do have the opportunity to brief lawmakers and regulators. Next week, I'll have another opportunity to do that at the FCC, and I briefed at the Fed last month. But at this point, as a nonprofit organization, we offer best practices. We're working with companies to figure out what the standards are that they could sign on for, and an important part of upholding these standards is making sure that they are continually repeated. So it's not a one and done if you're looking to reduce bias in AI. It is a rinse, wash, repeat, because as we know, AI is iterative and these biases will continue to pop up in different or similar ways over time. So at this point, it is absolutely voluntary, but would love your thoughts on how we can make that more mandatory.
So we'll have to end it here. And so thank you so much. I want to thank Professor Levendowski and Miriam Vogel for their presence today on this panel. I think.
Thanks for having us, Whitney.
Oh, anytime.
Thank you guys. This has been fun.
We'll put the stage up for you anytime. So thank you. It seems like AI is much like Groundhog Day. It is something that we repeat and learn until we can improve and move on to February 3rd. Thank you.